Order. The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
I call the honourable member Darian Fenton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What a glorious finale to a long process of the bill that was never needed. The bill that was never needed. And a problem that never existed, except in the member's mind, except in his experience of 30 years ago when he was a union organiser with the Clerical Workers Union, and except in his mind about what things used to be like when he was in fact the worst union organiser in New Zealand history. I doubt if he's been near a union since the time in the 1990s when he sold out and changed sides, and ever since then he has been standing up for the National Party and the National Party's attacks on workers. He's never voted against them, he's never spoken against them, and here he is saying this is a pro-worker, pro-union, freedom bill, a freedom to choose bill. I've got news for the member. Workers do have freedom of choice. They have freedom to join a union or not join a union. They have freedom to strike or not strike. They are not coerced. They are not marched out the door with their arm behind the back and made to strike. They do have freedom. They do have democracy, even though the member is trying to insert democracy into unions, which already exists. It already exists. Most unions already have secret ballots. If he had bothered to read a few unions' rules, he would see that most unions already have provisions that allow members to call for a secret ballot, and they do. It is not a problem, but what he has done is create a problem. Unions will comply with this bill. They comply with the law, of course they will. They will have to go through the expensive and unnecessary process, the compliance cost of changing their rules. We had this discussion during the debate and during the select committee process. Unions can't just get a piece of paper and change their rules and send it off to the Incorporated Societies office. They actually have to go through a democratic process. They have to meet their members. They have to vote on the rule changes. This takes some time. In my old union, we used to do something like 60 or 70 meetings all around New Zealand to change the rules. That is the process that's required, and that is the process that this bill will put unions through at a time when there are far more important things to be worrying about. The unions will do the job, but the people that will not cope are their members. The people who are not coping at the moment, Mr. Speaker, are union members. The members who are already struggling to get a decent pay increase and a fair deal at work. I was interested to hear the member Tohinare give a message to Tellys AFCO. While a little bit better than his minister was prepared to do today, Tellys AFCO has actually locked out those workers. They are now in their third month of being locked out. Now, I'm sure those workers would have liked to see some democracy in action when, by Tellys, the board of Tellys, actually voting on whether they should have been locked out. On the one hand, they want workers to have to vote for a strike, but shareholders don't. And so, as always, in the employment relationship, we have yet more imbalance. And it's the old view that workers shouldn't have a voice, and the view that we see increasingly from this government that workers should just shut up and be grateful to have a job. And what's major and really upsetting at the moment is the most toxic industrial relations environment we've seen in 2 decades, Mr. Speaker. And as I said, I've mentioned the AFCO workers. We've seen Westone workers having to go on strike, workers on $13.65 an hour, people having to get out in the street, the people they care for, the older residents they care for out with them. And of course we've had the ongoing Ports of Auckland dispute with some of the most incompetent management I've ever seen in my time in involvement in industrial relations. And these workers would have said, if Tohinare bothered to go and talk to any of the AFCO workers on the picket line in Mauriwa, in Wiri, in Horutu, in Imlay, in Fielding, in Wairoa, in these poor communities, they would have said, this isn't an important thing for us. This doesn't matter to us. What matters to us? What matters to us is that we can go back to work and earn a living and be treated fairly at work, but instead that's not going to happen. Now, I wanted to mention this bill comes at a time when this government is planning to bring in some new industrial laws. One is another ridiculous proposal, which is to fine workers for partial strikes. For a partial strike, for example, Mr. Speaker, the old work to rule. And, for example, workers could decide they're not going to answer the telephone during their meal breaks and rest breaks. I mean, that happens. They're often expected to do far more than they actually get paid for. But what this government's going to do is have this ridiculous process now where, first of all, the workers will have to be balloted as to whether they're going to have a partial strike, in other words, refuse to answer the telephone. And then, under the government's proposals, the union's going to have to give written notice of the strike. They do not have to give notice at the moment. They're going to have to give written notice, regardless of whether they're an essential industry or not. And that in itself can become the subject of an employment court or authority hearing, the notice and whether it's right or wrong, as indeed will these strike ballots be able to. And then the notice will have to provide the employer with all the details about how much time those workers spend answering the phone during their tea break. And then the employers are going to have to calculate what that money is, how much that is every day. And they have to identify that and notify the workers, and then they have to work out how much that is as a proportion of their day, so they can cut their pay. Because it's called a partial strike. And even if the worker is completing all of their hours, they can be paid less than minimum wage under this proposal. And this proposal is so ridiculous that the government is planning to change 3 pieces of legislation, all to stop another problem that doesn't exist. A problem like the member has tried to address that didn't exist in the first place. This is a problem about so-called partial strikes, 5 on average every year for the last 20 years. So what we've got is a problem that doesn't exist, that someone has said to the minister or to the government, oh, we had a bit of a problem because they refused to answer the telephone and we couldn't cut their pay. So now we're going to spend a whole lot of Parliament's time, bringing in a new provision that will further restrict the right to strike. That's got nothing to do with democracy. That's got nothing to do with workers' rights. It's got nothing to do with workers getting better pay and better wages. Got nothing to do with catching up with Australia or any of those type of things that the government said they'd like to do or they want to do. It's got nothing to do with democracy because, as I said, if this was about democracy, the member would have accepted my amendment to require shareholders to hold a ballot where there was a lockout. He would have accepted my amendment, very sensible amendment, that instead of having a whole bill, we just have a requirement that unions have a provision in their rules. That would have stopped all this stupid bill for an unnecessary problem. What this is really about is reducing unionism and collective bargaining in New Zealand. That is the agenda of this government. That is the agenda of this government. That is what your government, that's your manifesto. Why doesn't the member read his manifesto and see what your government is planning to do? And even if, I'm afraid, if Toa Henare had gone and visited the Tello's AFCO workers, I doubt he would have listened. Because what's happening to them is indefensible. Just like this bill, this is not defensible. It's going to make life tougher for unions and workers, and when you combine it with the government's plans to weaken collective bargaining, to weaken unions and to cut people's pay, this is going to be a disaster. So I encourage the member, please do go and see the AFCO's Telly's workers, and you'll find that what they're concerned about is feeding their families. It is poor communities and poor workers that are supporting them at the moment. $30 a week is what their families are living on, and guess who's providing the money? It's other workers who've...
What's the meat workers doing then?
The meat workers members are providing the money, the CTU and the officials are providing the money as well. So instead of arguing, go and talk to some real workers, Mr Toa Henare, and find out what the real life of workers and unions is all about today.
Mr Speaker.